NBC News correspondent Rahema Ellis is outside the courthouse on Long Island, and here with me in New York, former federal prosecutor Barrett Berger and former prosecutor Paul Callan. Okay, Rahema, set the scene. What is going to go down today?
What we think is going to go down is a very short story compared to the years of deceptive stories that George Santos has been accused of and has now admitted to committing. And when he goes into this courtroom for a hearing before the judge, this is a sentencing hearing, he and the prosecution, they've already presented letters to the judge about what their expectations are and hopes are. Santos saying that he wants a minimum sentence along with the aggravated identity theft charge that he's pled guilty to. That carries a mandatory minimum of 2 years in prison. He says he wants that minimum. But the prosecution is asking for so much more, anywhere from more than 7 years in prison, because they say, despite the fact that last summer, George Santos came to this courthouse and expressed his regret, his remorse, and his guilt on 2 of the charges, as you mentioned. The prosecution says that he has since done everything but that in terms of his actions and showing no remorse. And they are concerned if he's not given a hefty sentence, that he has a proclivity for recidivism, if you will, because showing no remorse for these crimes he committed and that he has admitted guilt to. Anna?
Barrett, this is your former office. Prosecutors asking for 7 years. Does 7 years fit the crime?
In my mind, it does. But it's not, they're just not pulling this number out of nowhere. They're not just making this number up. It's actually a pretty scientific process to get to this number. So what the prosecutors will do and what the judge will ultimately do during sentencing is they look to 2 things. The first is the statute. So as we mentioned, it's a 24-month mandatory minimum sentence, right? The judge has no wiggle room in this. She has to sentence him to at least 2 years. But that 2-year sentence has to run consecutively to what he gets on the other count. And his guideline range, the other part of this scientific process is what's called the sentencing guideline range. That is 51 to 63 months. So these 2 things have to go, consecutively, which gets you right into that 7-year range. So absolutely reasonable because it's prescribed by both the guidelines and the statute. But even more than that, it really fits the brazen public nature of this crime. I mean, this wasn't just a con man doing sort of small-scale crime in his backyard here. This was somebody taking, public office, stealing money from people who had contributed to his campaign and really putting us into a potentially risky situation for our national security by having all these lies out there as a public figure.
And yet, Paul, Santos's lawyers say he should get the minimum. He's also agreed to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines, and they are focusing on the nonviolent nature of his crimes. They write this in a letter to the court. His conduct, though involving dishonesty and abuse of trust, stemmed largely from a misguided desperation related to his political campaign rather than inherent malice. How strong is that argument?
Well, the lawyers have to come up with something to say, and they've come up with this. Their client is the P.T. Barnum of wire fraud and identity fraud. I mean, he runs for a congressional seat in Long Island on a completely fraudulent resume, saying he had worked at Goldman Sachs and was successful there, and for Citigroup, that he's the owner of 17 properties, essentially that he's an extremely wealthy individual, a graduate of Baruch College. By the way, he never went to Baruch College. He never worked at Goldman Sachs. Nobody vetted the guy, and somehow he was elected to Congress. So he's somebody who really abused the system. And I think when the judge looks at this, she's going to see somebody running for public office to represent the people of Long Island who is a complete fraud. And I think judges come down hard on people who abuse public service. There's kind of a double standard and a higher standard, I think, that applies to people who are in public service. And I think that's the problem his attorneys are going to face when they see their client sentenced today.
And Rahema, he did plead guilty, but ahead of this sentencing, he has been attacking the DOJ, saying on social media, they want me to go to prison for 87 months while they let sex traffickers walk freely. They give drug lords slaps on the wrist. He also claims a cabal of pedophiles operate in the government, all while the DOJ gets to, quote, step on my neck. So those are among the many posts he's been putting out there. Prosecutors say this proves he's not remorseful. How is Santos defending these posts?
Well, Santos says that he should be allowed to still speak for himself in terms of his feelings. I want to show you a full screen of some of how he says, responds to all of that. He says, I did this to me. I am responsible. But saying I'm sorry does not require me to sit quietly while these prosecutors try to drop an anvil on my head. That's the kind of thing that the prosecutors are going to be presenting to the judge, because on one hand, he says he's responsible, and on the other hand, he's accusing the prosecutors of doing something to him that he has already admitted guilt to. So it's sort of a double standard. In some way, it's kind of what George Santos has done as far as his public life is concerned. He's said that he is one thing, as was just mentioned, but the reality is that he's something very different. Anna?
Barrett, this free speech framing, what's the argument the prosecutors will make against that?
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly the idea that you are showing no remorse if you are still speaking lightly of your crimes. Even the title of his podcast, Pants on Fire, makes it seem like he thinks this is a joke, that this was all just, farcical. But these were real people that were affected. It was a real public office. He stole real money, and he defrauded people out of funds that they had worked hard for. So this is a real crime. I think the judge will look very disfavorably on all of his comments, on things that he said on the podcast, all of his behavior. And remember, the judge has a lot of freedom when she's sentencing him to take this into account, not only because it relates to the crime, because it relates to his acceptance of responsibility, how seriously he takes these offenses.
Paul, as we understand it, Santos did not solicit any letters of support from family or friends. How unusual is that, and could that work against him?
Well, it's very unusual, but I think probably the family and friends have been defrauded by his false claims as well as the public. So it doesn't surprise me at all that he has very little support from his family. He's a strange, bizarre individual, and he got elected to Congress at a time when his vote was critical to keep the Republican majority. And so they delayed in throwing him out of Congress, essentially because they needed his vote. And so he had this bizarre career of running on a fraud, serving in a fraudulent position when everybody knew he didn't deserve to hold that position. And now he's claiming a free speech right to say that explain why he's not being remorseful about his crime. It's not going to help him in front of the judge.
Sounds like you both agree the judge is likely to come down hard on Santos. We'll be watching and, of course, staying on top of it. Rahema will keep us posted as this hearing gets underway. Thank you all for joining us. Rahema Ellis, Barrett Berger, and Paul Callan. Appreciate it.